Welcome to Come Follow Me. We're in week 28 of the Old Testament, and we're dealing with the first part of 2 Kings today. If you remember from last week, the kingdom of Israel now split into two. We have Judah and the two tribes on the south side with the capital in Jerusalem. The kingdom of Israel, also known as the kingdom of Samaria, simply because the capital city is in Samaria, and that's the 10 tribes of the north. From the Old Testament Seminary Manual, the book of 2 Kings outlines the causes of the scattering of Israel. Because of the wickedness of the people in the northern kingdom of Israel, they're conquered by the Assyrians in 721. Unfortunately, Judah does not learn from the mistakes of Israel. Even though some of the kings of Judah mentioned in 2 Kings were faithful and obedient, there were many who were wicked. One of these kings was King Manasseh, whose wickedness caused Judah to lose its divine protection. Babylon then enters and crushes the southern kingdom and carries its people into captivity in 587, fulfilling Lehi's promise that Jerusalem would be destroyed. Taking you back here to the first book of Samuel, which we dealt with a few weeks ago, because as you can see here, the first book of Samuel was otherwise called the first book of Kings. And the reason I'm telling you that is because the second book of Kings is commonly called the fourth book of Kings. And I know that's confusing, but 1st and 2nd Samuel were originally called 1st and 2nd Kings, and 1st and 2nd Kings were actually called 3rd and 4th Kings. It's just to begin the confusion, and I'm going to warn you that today's lesson is going to be a little bit confusing because we're going to go through many of the kings of both the northern and southern kingdom in Israel, and some of them have the same names. Okay, if you remember last week, we were dealing with Ahab and his wife Jezebel and the prophet Elijah and all that happened there. And then in Sunday school this morning, you'll remember that we talked a great deal about Jehoshaphat. So to start off with, Moab rebels against Israel. Moab had been a client state and had been paying tribute to Israel. And when Ahab died, they rebelled. Ahab's son, Ahaziah, fell through the lattice in his upper chamber and was quite seriously hurt. And so he sent his servants to go and inquire of Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron, as to whether or not he would recover. But an angel of the Lord came to Elijah the Tishbite and said, "Meet this group of messengers from the king, and say unto them, Is it not because there is not a God in Israel that you go to inquire of Baal-zebub?" So he interrupts them and gives them the message that the king will not survive, that he will die. And so they return and tell the king this message from Elijah. And the king wants to know, who was this guy? And they said, "We didn't ask his name, but he was a hairy man." And then the king realizes that it's Elijah the Tishbite. And so the king's not very happy, and he sends a captain of 50 with his men to go up and to get Elijah off of a mount. And the captain spake unto him, saying, "Thou man of God, the king hath said, Come down." And Elijah answered, this is verse 10, and said to the captain of 50, "If I be a man of God, let fire come down from heaven and consume thee and thy 50. And it does. Remember Elijah and his fascination with fire from heaven. So they consume these 51 individuals. But the king sends another group, and the same thing happens to them. They're consumed from lightning from heaven. And then he sent a third captain with his 50. But this captain is a little bit wiser, and he goes partway up the hill, falls on his knees, and says to Elijah, "O man of God, I pray thee, let my life and the life of these 50 thy servant be precious in thy sight." And so he doesn't burn them up like he did the other two groups before him. Verse 15, "And the angel of the Lord said unto Elijah, Go down with him, be not afraid of him. And he arose and went down with him unto the king." And he tells the king in person that he's going to die, and that's exactly what happens. The king dies according to the word of the Lord, and his brother, because he had no offspring, reigns in his stead. These were both sons of Ahab and Jezebel. Verse 18 is interesting, because it says, "Now the rest of the acts of Ahaziah, which he did, are they not written in the book of Chronicles of the kings of Israel?" Now this is not the same book of Chronicles that we have in the Bible. This is a book that we don't have access to, and they haven't found yet. Chapter 2, we are now reintroduced to Elisha, who has become a student of Elijah and is to be the next prophet. And Elijah says to Elisha, "Tarry here," and then he's going to go to Bethel. And Elisha says something very interesting. He says, "As the Lord liveth, and as thy soul liveth, I will not leave thee." This is a very forceful type of oath. Now, the sons of the prophets were at Bethel, and Elijah wants to go and instruct them, and Elisha says, "No, I'm going to go with you." And after he instructs the sons of the prophets there, he says he has to go to Jericho. And the same thing happens. Elisha says, as the Lord liveth and as thy soul liveth, I will not leave you. And so he goes there and instructs with them. And then the third time they have to go to Jordan, and the exact same thing happens. And while they're at Jordan, Elijah took his mantle and smites the water. And the water parts, just like the Red Sea. And they're able to go over on dry ground. Now, I talked a little bit in Sunday school about the sons of the prophets. But from the Bible dictionary, you can see that the sons of the prophets were groups of disciples who met together to worship the Lord and receive instructions under the direction of Elijah, the prophet, big P prophet. And this is where the idea of schools of the prophets came from that we talked about in previous year in the Doctrine and Covenants. So they cross over, and Elijah is going to be taken up into heaven, and he asked Elisha, what can I do for you? How can I bless you? And Elisha says something very interesting that is often misunderstood. He says, I pray thee, let a double portion of thy spirit be upon me. And a lot of people think that Elisha was saying, I want to be twice as spiritual, twice as powerful as you have been. And in fact, the writers of Kings seem to have agreed with this, because it talks about Elijah and his 7 or so miracles that are outlined, but Elisha has twice as many, 14. But in verse 10, Elijah says something interesting. He says, thou hast asked a hard thing. Now, a lot of people think that it was maybe too hard for Elisha to have twice as much power, but I don't think that that's what it's saying. Because if you look at the cross-reference under double portion, it refers you to the double portion that is given to the son with the birthright. And I think what's really being said here is that Elisha is saying, I want to be the prophet after you go, prophet with the big P. And that's why Elijah is saying, well, are you sure? Because this is a hard thing that you're asking, to become the prophet. And so this is a very famous story where Elijah is taken up in a chariot of fire. And as he's taken up, his mantle, his cloak falls, and Elijah picks it up and takes it. And when he recrosses over the river Jordan, he smites the water with it. And all of the sons of the prophets who are there view it and realize that the spirit of Elijah is now resting upon Elisha, and that he is taken over as being the prophet. This next part is kind of a little bit difficult to understand. So Elisha goes up from there to Bethel. Now remember, Bethel was the seat of pagan worship in the northern kingdom. And as he's going up there, it says in the King James translation that little children were mocking him. But if you look at the actual Hebrew, it's not little children, they're actually young adults, youth. And they say to him, go thou up, bald man, go thou up. He curses them, and then 2 bears come out of the woods and kill 42 of these youth. Now, that seems a little bit harsh. But you have to remember a couple of things. Remember that Elijah the Tishbite was a hairy man. And what they're doing here when they're mocking him, these people who grew up in a culture that did not recognize Jehovah, is that they were also saying that you're not like Elijah, you're not really a prophet. And they were denigrating his position as the prophet. And so the Lord took retribution against them. The New Oxford Annotated Bible says this number 42 is interesting because it's a number that sometimes is associated with death. And so it may not actually be the real number 42. It may be just a symbolic meaning of death. On to chapter 3. Here we meet Jehoram, who is another son of Ahab, and he begins to reign in Israel at the same time as Jehoshaphat is reigning in the kingdom of Judah. And he is evil, but not like his father. He puts away the image of Baal that his father and mother were so intent on infiltrating the whole area of Israel. If you remember last week, they killed off all of those prophets who believed in Jehovah and were really pushing the Canaanite worship of Baal. And he goes back to worshiping the 2 golden calves that were brought in by his ancestors. In chapter 3, we begin a story about how Israel, Judah, and Edom go against Moab. But instead of crossing over at the normal place near the Jordan River, they go around through the southern area, which is a desert. And they run into problems. So Jehoshaphat says, we have a prophet that we should inquire to him on how we should handle this problem. So the king of Israel and Jehoshaphat, who's the king of Judah, and the king of Edom go down to see the prophet. And Elisha says to them, if it weren't for the fact that Jehoshaphat, who was, as you remember, a righteous king of Judah, was here, he wouldn't talk to them. He asked them to bring someone, a minstrel, someone to play. This is very interesting because he has someone play this musical instrument so that he can get the Spirit. Then the hand of the Lord comes upon him, and that he indicates how they can win this battle. And he says, dig many ditches in the valley, and the Lord will give you the victory. So even though they don't understand the counsel of the prophet, they dig all these holes, and they fill with water. And then as the Moabite army comes and sees the reflection in the water, it looks like blood. And so they think that the three kings have fought against each other and they've killed each other and the land is full of blood. So they come rushing down to get the spoils, and they are defeated. So chapter 4 deals with a woman who's just lost her husband. She's now a widow, and the creditors are coming because she's not able to pay them, and they're likely going to take her 2 sons as payment. So she asks Elijah for help, and Elijah says, okay, what do you have in the house? And all she has is a pot of oil. So then he tells her to go and borrow from everyone, her neighbors, as many vessels as she can borrow, and then close the door and pour from the vessel of oil into all the different containers that you're able to borrow. And so she does that, and it keeps pouring and pouring until all the vessels are full. And then Elisha says to her, go and sell the oil, pay your debt, and you and your family can live. This miracle, of course, is very similar to the one that Elijah performed. And then the story talks about a woman, a great woman, who sees Elisha keep passing by her door. And she keeps encouraging him to stop there and to eat with them. And then she says to her husband, behold, this is verse 9, I perceive that this is a holy man, which passes by us continually. So let us make a little chamber, an attachment to their house, so that he can stay there. And so that's what she does. And Elisha stays there quite often. And then he blesses her that even though she's barren, that she will have a child. And as the years go by, the child grows up, and in an accident, he is hurt and then dies. Then she calls her husband and says, quickly, give me one of the young men and one of the donkeys, and let me go to the prophet. And the husband is puzzled and says, why do you have to go see the prophet? And she doesn't have time to explain to him. She just says, it's all going to work out. And so she gets on the donkey, and they go forward as fast as they can to see the prophet. I found this article that talks about her husband's question reflects the close connection between prophets and women. On Sabbath and festivals, women would go regularly on pilgrimages. They would also go for help in a crisis. When her husband asks him why she needs to go see the prophet, because it's not the regular season, she brushes him off with the simple, it shall all be well. His lack of understanding as to why she is going is puzzling, but she can't wait to explain to him. She has a child to save. Still, her independence is equally puzzling, for normally even a wealthy woman depended on her husband's goodwill. Women have power in their own households, but this particular woman does not show any concern that her husband might get angry or even divorce her. This lack of concern, her lack of desperation for a child, because she was barren, and her living among her own kin are all very unusual behaviors that make this woman stand out. So continuing with the story in 2 Kings 4, verse 27, so as she's approaching the prophet, his servant stops her, and then the prophet says, let her alone, for her soul is vexed within her, and the Lord hath hid it from me, and hath not told me. And then she said, did I desire a son of my Lord? And so she's questioning why she had to have a son and then lose him. So Elisha comes quickly to her house. He takes the child and lays him upon his bed. Remember, she had a side room for him. And again, this is very reminiscent of Elijah. He closes the door and he prays. Then he lays on the child, put his mouth on his mouth, his eyes to his eyes, stretches himself, and then the child begins to warm. And then he does it again, and then the child sneezes 7 times and opens his eyes. And then he takes the son down to the woman. And as I said before, this is very reminiscent of the same sort of miracle that Elijah did. Chapter 5 is perhaps one of the most famous of these miracles, and it has to do with Naaman, who is the captain of the host of the king of Syria, and he is a leper. Now remember, we've talked about this before. Leprosy isn't what we think of today. but it was some sort of a skin disease. And he's suffering with this leprosy. And there happens to be in his household a young maiden who is an Israelite who was captured during some sort of war campaign. And she says to Naaman's wife, "Would God my Lord were with the prophet that is in Samaria, for he would recover of his leprosy." And so somebody tells Naaman about this that was said by the maid from the land of Israel. This is very interesting because this is missionary work at its best. And so the king of Syria writes to the king of Israel and says, "Can you arrange to have this man, who's one of my great generals, cured?" And the king of Israel goes, "Am I God? I can't do this." And now he figures that the king of Syria is trying to start a war. But Elisha hears about it, and he tells the king of Israel to write back and tell this man to come and see him. And so Naaman arrives with his horses and his chariots, and he's at the house at the door of Elisha. And he's really expecting Elisha to come out and meet him, but Elisha doesn't. He just sends a messenger out and says, "Go and wash in Jordan 7 times, and you'll be cured." And Naaman is just so upset. He thought at least Elisha would come out and see him, and that he would do something dramatic and heal him. And he's concerned because the Jordan River is not exactly the cleanest river. In fact, he cites a couple of rivers that are in Damascus, where he's from, that are much cleaner. The Jordan River is very muddy, and so he turns away in a rage. And interestingly enough, his servants, like the servant of Naaman's wife, kind of cools him down and says, "Hey, if the prophet had bid thee do some great thing," this is verse 13, "wouldst thou have not done it? How much rather then when he said, wash and be clean?" Naaman, after he cools down, he goes to the river Jordan and dips himself 7 times, and his flesh becomes perfect again, clean. From M. Russell Ballard. What a humbling thing it must have been for Naaman to realize how close he came to allowing his own pride and his unwillingness to listen to the counsel of the prophet to prevent him from receiving such a great and cleansing blessing. And what a humbling thing it is to contemplate how many of us might miss out on a great and promised blessing because we do not listen and then do the relatively simple things our prophet is telling us to do. Then Naaman says in verse 15, "Behold, now I know there is no God in all the earth but in Israel. Now therefore I pray thee, take a blessing of thy servant," because he had brought all these gifts to give to the prophet. Some of the additional material that I was reading indicated that the amount of gifts, the amount of money that he brought, was phenomenal. It was millions and millions of dollars. But the prophet says, "As the Lord liveth, before whom I stand, I will receive none." And he urged him to take it, but he refuses. So he won't take money. That's not how we do things here. Chapter 6 is also an interesting chapter and very famous. The people that Elisha is teaching have grown in such numbers there's no room. The place where we dwell is too straight or narrow for us. Elisha says, "Okay, build some additional dwelling places." So they begin to cut down wood. And in verse 5, as one of them was felling a beam or a tree, the axe head falls into the water. And he's so upset because he's borrowed this axe head. And he is afraid it's probably an iron axe head. And it would have been very costly and would probably cause him to go into servitude because he can't pay for it. Elisha says, "Okay, where did it fall?" And then he takes a stick and he throws the stick into where the iron head fell, and the axe head floats. And so they pick it up. Now, this is very interesting because the people at this time believed that men of God could transfer properties. And so the reason that he threw in a stick was to increase their faith, because the floating property of the stick was then transferred to the iron axe head. From Thomas S. Monson, "Our Heavenly Father is aware of our needs and will help us as we call upon Him for assistance. I believe that no concern of ours is too small or insignificant. The Lord is in the details of our lives." So time passes, and then the king of Syria decides that he wants to go to war against Israel. As he's planning out his campaign, the prophet indicates to the king of Israel where they're going to be and to avoid that area. And this happens many times. So then the king of Syria, we're in verse 11, says, "Will you not show me which of us is for the king of Israel?" He's suggesting that there's a spy in their midst that keeps telling the Israelites how to avoid a battle and how to avoid losing the war. Then one of the servants, this is verse 12, says, "None, my lord, None of us are spies. But Elisha the prophet that is in Israel telleth the king of Israel the words that thou speakest in thy bedchamber. And he said, Go and spy where he is, that I might send and fetch him. And so they tell him that he's in Dothan. And so he sends his army to surround Elisha with their chariots and their horses. A great host of people encompassed the city. This is verse 15. And when the servant of the man of God was risen early and gone forth, behold, the host compassed the city both with horses and chariots. And the servant said unto him, Alas, my master, how shall we do? And Elijah answers, Fear not, for they that be with us are more than they that be with them. This is a really popular theme in Scripture that is used quite often in General Conference. But the servant doesn't understand. He can't see the same thing that Elisha sees. So Elisha prays and said, Lord, I pray thee, open his eyes that he may see. And the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire round about Elisha. I just wonder if Elijah was there too, with his chariot of fire. From President Eyring, like that servant of Elisha, there are more with you than those you can see opposed to you. Some who are with you will be invisible to your mortal eyes. The Lord will bear you up, and will at times do it by calling others to stand with you. So what happens here is Elisha prays again to the Lord, and he smites this army with blindness. And then he has to escort them, because they're all blind, and he takes them to the land of Samaria. And then he prays to have their eyes opened. The study Bible suggests that it's probably not the loss of physical sight, since the Syrians would not doubt their location just because they could no longer physically see it, but rather a dazed mental condition in which they are open to suggestion and manipulation, but still able to follow the prophet to Samaria. The Syrians are bedazzled, do not see things clearly, whereas Elijah's servant has been given perfect clarity of sight. This reminds me, of course, of the Jedi mind trick that Obi-Wan uses. These are not the droids you're looking for. So when they arrive there, the king of Israel says, Shall we smite them? And he says, No, don't smite them. You should feed them. And so he prepares a great feast for them. And after they've eaten and drunken, he sends them away, so they no longer come to the land of Israel to raid. Now, some time passes, and this is chapter 7, and they're at war again with the Syrians. Elisha prophesies something very interesting. He says, This time tomorrow, you'll be able to buy flour and barley really reasonable. And the man who works for the king is totally in disbelief. And he says, How can this be? And Elisha says to him, Behold, thou shalt see it with thine eyes, but thou shalt not eat thereof. And the reason that the man is so incredulous about this is because there's a double whammy happening here. There's a siege. And when there's a siege, there's always a shortage of food. But also there's a drought at the same time. So there's a drought and a siege. And the prophet is saying that you'll be able to buy food really cheap tomorrow. But what happens when they go out to check what the Syrians are doing? The Lord had made the Syrians hear noises of chariots and of horses, of a great host. And so they thought that the king of Israel had hired the king of the Hittites and the Egyptians to come and destroy them. And so they up and left in the middle of the night. And when the people go out and they see all that's left there, because they left in such a hurry, they left all of their possessions, including all of their food. And it was exactly what the prophet had predicted. You could buy food very cheap the very next day because there was such an abundance that was left by the Syrian army. But the guy that disbelieved, who was in charge of the gate, the people trod upon him and he dies. And so what the prophet had said had exactly happened. He heard about it, he knew about it, he saw it, but he wasn't able to eat it. In chapter 8, Elijah tells the woman who had been taking care of him, who he had raised her son from the dead, that she needs to leave because there's going to be a famine for 7 years. And so she did what he said, and she goes to live among the Philistines. But at the end she comes back only to find that somebody's taken over her land. So she goes to the king to try to get justice. At that very moment, the king was talking to the servant of Elisha. The servant was explaining to him about the miracles that Elisha had done. And just as he's explaining, one of the people that was the subject of the miracle walks in. And he says, This is the woman that I've been talking about, whose son was raised from the dead. And so the king restores her land. And then we have a whole series of nasty things that happen in chapters 8 and 9 murders. There's a changeover of several different kings. And then Jehu, the king of Israel, comes to the throne. And he's an interesting character. He assassinates some of the other kings, and he executes Jezebel. Now remember, we talked about this last week, that she was thrown from a window and then eaten by dogs. Kind of gruesome. But I wanted to show you on the timeline how this works, so that Jehu is here in the north. He comes after Joram. And in the south, there's a king here for just a little bit of time, and then his mother takes over. And she's a real piece of work. This is the chart that I showed you this morning in Sunday school that shows the ratio of good to bad kings. And you can see in the north, there are no really great kings. There's one lukewarm king, is the one that we're talking about, Jehu. And then the kings in the south, the kings of Judah, we have a couple of really good ones, and then mostly not so good. Jehu, who was the best king that there is in the north, he destroys the house of Ahab and all of the worshippers of Baal. But he continues to worship the golden calves that are in Bethel and Dan. So there's Jehu here. Meanwhile, in the south, Ahaziah dies, and his mother kills all of the potential heirs, and then she starts to reign herself. In her attempt to kill all of the royal family, she misses one, who's hidden away, and she's not aware of it. And then he becomes the next king. And he reigns for quite a long time, like 40 years. He reigns in righteousness, and he fixes up the temple, and then he buys the security of Jerusalem by giving away all the precious items that are in the temple. But then he is eventually slain, and the next king takes over. At the same time, Elisha dies, and they bury him. They are then invaded by the Moabites. And as they're burying Elisha, another man who is dead is cast into his grave by accident. And when this man is let down and touches the bones of Elisha, he's revived. And he stands up on his feet and gets out of the grave, and everybody's in shock. Which all goes to prove that you can't keep a good man down, right? Anyway, so let's leave it there for this week. I hope you've enjoyed our overview of what happens in the first part of 2 Kings. Keep up your reading, and I will see you on Thursday. Have a great week.